Hello, Grace City Church. I'm Dan Holder, and I'm coming to you in place of Jeremy Martinson today, and it's my joy to do so, to be with you in this way while we are a scattered church. And during this sermon series, we're talking about what does it mean to be a scattered church, and specifically today, we're going to talk about what does it mean to have joy while we're a scattered church. You know, being scattered is hard. Like there's some major differences that we've been talking about. Like one of those is like when we have normal church, we come in and we see each other and we shake hands, we wave, right? And sometimes we see people because we come at a different time or they come at a different time, and we see different people and we get to mix with the whole body of Christ. And we just don't get to do that in this setting in the same way, right? So we set up Zoom meetings so we can still stay connected, but it's just not the same. And so it's good to be together, but we're not entirely together. And it's good to feel the weight of that because it's not what God intended. We live in a sinful and a broken world, and this isn't what God intended. In fact, some of us are feeling that also with our coworkers, right? It's just relationships are just different with coworkers now that so many of us are working from home, right? It's also different like when we're out in society because like we might come up to somebody in the parking lot of the grocery store and they're coming towards us and we're coming towards them, and then we're kind of on a collision course unless something happens here and we make eye contact like, are you gonna move? Am I gonna move? How nervous are you? How nervous am I? And then that person starts swerving, so like, man, I'm going this way, we're gonna swerve around each other, right? Everything's just awkward and weird, and we just don't know how to relate to one another. We don't really know how each person is feeling about the situation because everybody's kind of having different reactions. So being scattered is hard. But in this new reality that we're in, what does it look like to be faithful? What does it look like to be a faithful church, to be a faithful husband, a wife, a co-worker, a friend, a father, a son, or a daughter? And we're going to not deal with all of those specifics in this message, but we are going to deal with, I feel like, an overarching concept that will affect every one of those relationships, and that is how to have joy as a scattered church. I think it's helpful to recognize when it feels like everything is changing. I think it's helpful to recognize like not everything has changed. It gives us a little bit of perspective to remember that some things are not changing. And perspective is a good word. A lot of people are using perspective right now. Perspective is a good word, but perspective in and of itself isn't enough. We need to see what God sees. God's perspective is very unique. The best way for us to see what God sees, I think, is to open up His Word, to read it, to recognize what those people at that time were experiencing, and how God interacted with them, how God cared for them, how God brought them through those experiences. Because we know that our faithfulness comes and goes, whether we're scattered or not. But God's faithfulness has never and will never change. And the fact that God's faithfulness has never changed and will never change, that brings us joy. So that's why I titled this sermon, Joy in a Scattered Church. Because even though we're in a scattered state, and things are new and things are changing, and it's awkward and scary and sometimes lonely, and let's be honest, sometimes it's really hard and maybe even depressing. Some of us are struggling, right? God knows that we're struggling. We're here, right? We care for one another. We go through this together, and some of us are facing some of the hardest things we've ever faced in our life. And we're facing that during a pandemic when it's the hardest to be supported. We need to hold on to the fact that God is still faithful, and that He is with us, and that He is for us, and He's for His glory. So with that in mind, let's hear from Alex Tweeten as he reads Hebrews chapter 10.
Good morning, Grace City Church. My name is Alex Tweeten, and I'll be doing your scripture reading today. Today we're going to be going through Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 through 39. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Have a good day, Grace City Church.
Thank you very much, Alex. So the context of Hebrews chapter 10 is that in the first 9 chapters of Hebrews, the author has laid out the case. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the promised one. He's the one that the Old Testament prophecies were about. He is the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world. You can know it. You can trust it. It's reliable. It's true. And so then in chapter 10, the author gets to the point now where like, okay, so because that's true, then what does that mean for us? How do we live in this crazy world that we're in if that is really true? So there's some specific encouragement here for those believers because they needed reassurance. I mean, they were facing very intense persecution. Some were being thrown into prison. Some were being persecuted at their workplaces. Some were being persecuted at their homes. They needed reassurance. And Hebrews chapters 1 through 9 gives great reassurance. And then Hebrews 10 through the rest continues giving that reassurance along with some, okay, so what do we do now? How do we live in this crazy life? So my first main point is that joy is not stopped by our circumstances. The encouragement that existed for these Hebrew believers, I think, also encourages us. And one of the things that we need to know about ourselves is that our timeline tends to be very short. We look at life in too small of a perspective. My perspective tends to be too small. I used to teach history, so you'd think that I would have a bigger perspective, but I don't. I think way too small. But one of the things that I used to teach my history students is that there aren't new problems in the world, but there are new people dealing with old problems. You know, as Americans, we tend to think, I've got a vote, I've got a voice, I'm a person that can make a difference in this world. And that's not untrue. But we also tend to think that because of that, like I can solve pretty much any problem that I want to solve in 5 to 7 business days. And if I sign up for Amazon Prime, then I can get it down to 2. But that's a very small timeline and a very small perspective. So we need to step back. We need to think about what God has said about our life. God has said that our life is like a flower, and it quickly grows and it quickly dies. So when God says that our life is short, but to us it feels different, then our perspective is not the same as God's perspective. So when we look at verse 32 in Hebrews, the author says, remember the former days. So these events that are happening in this passage, they've already occurred, and they're able to look back on them in this passage. So remember the former days. So I want to take just a quick time to do that, to tell just a few stories and remember some former days. So think about this. God is referred to as the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. And if you know your Old Testament history and you know the drama in that family and the twists and the turns of that story and the ups and the downs and the ways in which it's like, this is not going to come together. This is not what's supposed to be happening. But God does bring it all together. And we get to remember God as the Father, as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is a perspective type name for God. I also think about another event. This is one of my favorite stories of the New Testament church time, where Paul and the disciples are preaching the gospel. That's not true. So my first main point for today is that joy is not stopped by our circumstances. You know, the encouragement that the Hebrew believers needed during their time is similar encouragement to what we need. We need to be reassured that Jesus is the Christ. We need to be reassured that there are former days. That's not true. So my first main point today is that joy is not stopped by our circumstances. You know, our timeline and our view of our life tends to be too small. My timeline and my view of my life tends to be too small. I used to teach history, and one of the things that I used to tell my students that I sometimes need to be reminded of myself is that, there are not new problems in the world, but there are new people dealing with old problems. We tend to think that we can solve any problem in 5 to 7 business days. I mean, after all, we're Americans, so we have a voice and we have a vote, and we can change the world. And that's the way we tend to think about it. And that's not entirely wrong. But and for us as Americans, we can also sign up for Amazon Prime, and then we can solve pretty much anything in 2 business days. So lots of things are pushing us to believe that on a very short timeline, everything can change. But God works on a different timeline. God says that our whole life is like a flower that grows quickly and dies quickly. So when God says our life is short, but we don't feel that way, we feel like our life is long, then our perspective isn't the same as God's. And so with all these things that we think about time, I think we need to set those aside, and we need to get God's perspective on our time in history as best we can. So I just want to tell a few stories in the vein of what the Hebrew author says. Let's recall the former days. Let's take a little look back. And let's remember some of the things that God has done. So let's start with this. In the Old Testament, God is referred to as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So when we think about that, we think about the Old Testament history, and we think about all the twists and the turns and the drama and the confusion and the crazy events that happen in the Old Testament. And it just looks like it's not all going to come together. But it does. In God's sovereignty, it all comes together. Another story from the New Testament that comes to mind about the craziness and what with God's perspective is different than our perspective. So Paul goes to Ephesus, and the gospel is spreading. And the gospel is spreading so quickly that businesses are shutting down. We have businesses shutting down today, but this was for a different reason. The businesses that were shutting down were the businesses that made money off of idol worship. And so because so many people were becoming Christians, the idol shops had to close down. They had no business. So they bring Paul in. The business owners get together and they say, we got to stop this. They bring Paul into a riot. They start a riot in the city, and everybody's all fired up and trying to get rid of Paul and trying to get rid of this Christianity stuff. And finally somebody in the riot says, hey, we're going to get in trouble for throwing a riot here. We got to let this guy go. But you think about that story, like it seems like everything's going great. The church is growing. People are responding to the gospel. And then this twist comes in where the city kind of tries to throw them out. But guess what? We know that because of the book of Ephesians, we know that the gospel did grow there. The churches were planted. So God made it work. He preserved and protected his people. And it all was coming together as church grew. Jump ahead quite a ways. I want to tell you a story about a group of people called the Walloons. So pause for a moment. Kids in the room. Hey kids, can you say the word Walloon? I think this is a super fun word to say. And so I want to tell you a couple of stories about the Walloons. The Walloons lived in the 1500s in Europe, and a number of them were forced to flee their homes. So we're stuck in our homes in this time, but they were forced to leave their homes. And when they were forced to leave their homes, they went to other cities. And so there's a group of Walloons that went to a city named Wessel. And as I say Wessel, some of you might think about Frozen 1. Remember the short little guy? He had the mustache. He was from Wesselton or Weaseltown? Wesselton? Maybe some kids in the room have an opinion. Was it Wesselton or Weaseltown? Anyway, so there's a city named Wessel. The Walloons went to Wessel, which is kind of funny. And when they got there, they said, let's define ourselves as a people. So they wrote something called a confession. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just want to read a couple of comments from it. But it's really interesting that they're being persecuted by the government. And this is something that shows up in their confession. It says, also, concerning magistrates or government and the power of the sword, we feel and maintain that it is necessary to honor and obey the magistrates, not only the good and humble, but the rude and wicked, as much and so long as they do not command anything against Christ. So here these people had to leave their home because of the government, and then they write this confession that we should honor the government. They went a little bit further, actually. Later on, they wrote a letter to King Philip II. And in that letter, they went further and they said this. They said, "We offer our backs to stripes, our tongues to knives, our mouths to gags, and our whole bodies to the fire, rather than deny the truth of this confession." You know, they had something to lose by saying that Jesus is the Christ. The Hebrew believers had something to lose by saying that Jesus is the Christ. And the encouragement comes in the book of Hebrews in the verse 32 that says, "Remember the former days." There are ways in which the church has been protected and preserved that we have to remember. If God can protect and preserve those brothers and sisters, He can protect and preserve us. Let's take a few minutes to answer some questions, and then we'll come right back.